And the second reading today comes from Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 to 20. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven.
Thank you, Hannah. Folks, when I was at college, it was pretty hard. It was tough. And I was working hard, and some of my friends said to me, don't work so hard, just do enough for a pass. I didn't know what that meant. What's enough for a pass? I think that suggestion, that question is what most Australians who don't know Jesus, most people in the world are trying to figure out. If there is a God, what's a pass look like? So that we can go to heaven. Is it just don't murder anyone? Is it come to church every week? What does a pass look like? Imagine, take you back to school or university, if you had a lecturer teacher say to you, right, it's the final exam. It's the big one. And if you would like to know more about sitting this exam, then come back to the classroom at lunchtime, we'll talk it through. So you and others are spilling into the room and you see the smarty guys, they're over there, and you're a bit uncertain about how it's all going to go for you. You're not top of the class, and your lecturer or teacher says to you, right, unless you get a better grade than these smarty guys, the top of the class, it's a fail. Right, we'll see you next week. Oh, you're thinking, hang on, should I just give up now? If these guys can't pass, what hope have I got? Do you walk away in that moment? Well, here we are in chapter 5. As we said, we're poised to hear Jesus deliver the detail about what it looks like to live the Sultan life community. And we're on the edge of our seats, bring it on, Jesus. And he then pauses and says, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. How would you respond right there? Would you walk away from Jesus? Would you leave that mountain and give up and go home? Because if the Pharisees, the poster boys of religion, aren't going to pass, the smarties of the class, what's the point in trying? What chance have you got? I wonder what people thought when they heard Jesus say that. And what about that other strange thing he said? Verse 17, do not think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. What did he mean by that? What is Jesus playing at? Why did he press pause and say these two things before he began teaching us what it all looks like? And you know what? It's a little confusing because he said he didn't come to do away with the law, yet we don't practice the law, do we? I mean, the detail of the law of worship and sacrifice. We don't do that. We're not doing that this morning. Jesus went on to say he didn't come to remove the smallest punctuation mark from the Old Testament. The law and the prophets remain till this world passes away. And then he adds, when all is accomplished. Anyone who waters down the commandments will be, in the meantime, will be judged. Okay, wow. And if Jesus isn't removing the law of the Old Testament, then shouldn't we be offering some sacrifices of animals over here? Like a high priest, and shouldn't we be throwing all the bacon out of the fridge? If we're really going to follow all the law of the Old Testament. What exactly is Jesus saying in this passage? I think we have to hear him something like this. Now I'm going to paraphrase and add some ideas. I think he's saying, listen to my words of spiritual revolution, but if you think that I'm some anti-Moses rebel rabbi come to destroy the law, to deconstruct it, to dumb it down, to redefine it, to make it easier to be saved, then think again. I've come to fulfill it. And in ways you won't understand at first. He's saying, I'm not softening the law because the commandments reflect the character of the holy and righteous God, don't they? And the prophets point to him in this very moment. Both have an important purpose in the master plan of salvation of God. He's saying, I'm here to fulfill it. This is my moment. Now, let's do some thinking about this, because fulfill the law is a little unclear at this end of at Matthew's gospel, right at the beginning. Is he saying, watch me carefully, I will faithfully fulfill the law in the sense of obeying it perfectly, the one true Israelite, or is he saying, I will fulfill the demands of the law? It's like we've got two different options of hearing this. So let me just illustrate the second, where if he is saying, I haven't come to destroy the law, but I've come to fulfill it. I haven't come to redefine it. Okay. When COVID first started happening, we defined something. We defined close contact, remember? And we put some laws around that, some isolation laws and punishments for not isolating when we came in contact with a close contact. Did anyone get pinged at Bunnings? Okay, a few of us. But then we realised New South Wales doesn't have the capacity or the resources to meet the demands of those close contact laws. In other words, we would have to put a lot of people from essential services in long lockdowns. We can't cope with that. So what's the solution? Redefine the law. Redefine what a close contact means so that the laws could fit our limited hospital resources and our economic capacity. Well, that's pretty wild when you think about it. If you've got a problem, redefine it away. And I love this little meme that was running around. Since we're redefining everything, this is a cordless hole punch. But you get the idea. Jesus is saying, I haven't come to redefine. In the crisis of sin, Jesus says he hasn't come to soften or redefine the law to make the problem go away. He calls sin out for what it is. It is a violation of the holiness of God. And so he comes to meet the penalty of the law on our behalf in his death on the cross. He comes to fulfill the requirement of the law. Well, that's quite convincing, isn't it? So which is it? Did he come to fulfill the law in the sense of obeying the law perfectly, or did he come to fulfill the law in the sense of meeting the requirements of the law? Well, by the time we get to the other end of Matthew's gospel and the cross, don't we see that it's both? He does both. He fulfills the law by obeying it obedience so that he is worthy to meet the law's demands on our behalf. And after his death and resurrection on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24, he says to his disciples, this must have been a great moment. He says, how foolish you are and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And he explained to them what was said in all scriptures concerning himself. The Bible is all about how to be right with God. It asks the big question, if God is holy and we are pathologically sinful and stained by sin, how can we ever hope to be reconciled to him? What chance have we got? And Jesus is saying, me. I am the answer to the question. Jesus obeys the law perfectly so he can be worthy to fulfill the law. Every question is answered in him, and that's why Paul will say in 2 Corinthians, for no matter how many promises God has made, they are yes in Christ. The word fulfill is something we've got to get our heads around if we're to understand Jesus. But the other odd thing that Jesus said was, your righteousness should surpass that of the Pharisees. We've got to understand righteousness. Well, we're not going to follow what he's saying. We're not going to follow this whole idea. And so far we've heard Matthew use righteousness in three kind of different ways. Firstly, Jesus is said to have been baptised to fulfil all righteousness back in chapter 3. Secondly, Jesus talks about hungering and being persecuted for righteousness. And now we've just heard him say people need a better righteousness than the Pharisees. Seems like there's slightly different ways of using the word righteous across those three instances. And because we've studied Romans together last year, we know that righteousness is not like our goodness, our inherent goodness, but it's the new status that God conveys on us when we trust Jesus. Through faith in Christ, we are declared right. God says a new thing about us. He says, you're my people, and you're right in your relationship with me. Okay, that's our Paul's definition of righteousness, declared right. But does that fit each of those three instances we just talked about in Matthew? Or does it carry some different freight each time? So let's go back, let's do some thinking. Let's go back to the Old Testament and hear how that word righteousness, was used in the Old Testament originally. And this is certainly pushing me out of my comfort zone to try and pronounce a Hebrew word, tiskol. And it means righteous. It translates as righteous. And you wouldn't believe it. It means God's acts to save. Simply that. In other words, God's righteousness is to act in justice and mercy to save his people. Before we go to Paul and get all forensic about it and use all his examples, God's acts to save his people. And so righteousness and justice, God acting justly, are linked, righteousness and justice. Okay, let's just park that there for a moment. And by rescuing his people, he's doing something else. He's vindicating them. Always did in the Old Testament. That was, he was saying to the rest of the nations, hands off, these are my people. Israel not only received the gift of being rescued, they received the gift of a new status, his people in relationship with him. The last move in this is those who receive the gift of God's justice and saving mercy, how do they respond? Righteously, justly, justice. They want to follow the one and the character of the one who saved them. They will live justly. So in Micah 6, and maybe this is a memory verse for people, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly before your God. Yeah, lots of us know that verse. How does it fit? Well, in Micah 6, Israel are called to remember God's saving acts in the past, his righteousness, so they'd know him personally within a relationship of righteousness, within that framework, so that they'd respond by acting justly and loving mercy and walking humbly with their God. It just fits. What comes first? It's always God's saving acts. Our response follows. So now we'll do this move. We're in the Old Testament. Now we're moving into somewhere like Romans or Galatians with Paul, and he is saying, "You darn tootin', you don't earn righteousness by what you do first. It's God who has moved first, who has acted to save us. And he gives us, by faith, that status in right relationship, righteous." And that's a lot to take in. But hopefully we can see something of how that little word, righteousness, works in describing salvation. So if we've got a bit of a grasp of that, let's now take it back to those 3 instances in Matthew, see if it fits, see if it works. So firstly, Jesus was baptized to fulfill all righteousness. The thing is, Jesus didn't get baptized because he was repenting of sin like everybody else. He was being commissioned to be an instrument of God's righteous act to save. He was fulfilling that. Jesus' response was being obedient to stand with sinful humanity in God's expression of righteousness. Okay, we think that fits. Yeah, we can work with that. Well, secondly, what about when Jesus speaks of hungering and being persecuted for righteousness? Well, those people we saw in the Beatitudes are those who are hungry for God's reign of mercy and justice, hungry for salvation and to respond by themselves, acting justly in the world. That fits. And then we come to this idea. Your righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees. And that doesn't fit. Doesn't seem to work. Because it sounds like be better, do better, work harder than these Pharisees. We didn't expect that from Jesus. Instead, we thought he'd say, don't be like the Pharisees. They haven't got a clue. But he says, be even better. He's saying you'll need more righteousness, a better grade than the smartest kids in the class, or you will get a kingdom fail. Well, what do we think Jesus is doing here? Because I think he's throwing a curveball. I think he's doing something similar to what he does in the parables. He's stretching us to think. You see, and you know this, by the time of the Pharisees, this is post-exile. After their exile, they've come back from Babylon. They're living out the kingdom a second go, if you like. And they're so determined to keep the law perfectly this time that the Pharisees create an extra set of rules, an extra code to keep so that you can keep the other laws. Make no mistakes so you can really be sure. And you know, there's some of those laws like on the Sabbath you cannot work, so you can't walk more than 1 mile from your home. And there was that beautiful moment in John 5 when Jesus had just healed the paralytic man, the guy who was lame, and he picks up his mat and he's walking through the town going, look at me everyone, I'm walking. And suddenly the Pharisees put their little siren on the top of the car and they pull him over and they say, breaking the Sabbath. What am I doing? You're carrying your mat. code, and I can't remember what number it was, but carrying a mat is like furniture removal. Literally, this was in the code. You are breaking the Sabbath by removing furniture from your house and walking with it. Oh my goodness. The Pharisees were so determined to get justice and obedience right, they went in the other direction. And it became less about God's righteousness in the sense of his saving acts, and it became all about the individual's righteousness. Us saving ourselves, trying to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. So this is how I hear Jesus saying, your righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees. I hear Jesus saying, if you want to do that, if you plan to impress God with a pass mark, then the pass mark is 100% perfect holiness. That's what a pass mark looks like before the holy God. And at the same time, if you plan to go in that direction, don't look at these guys, because they may look holy, but in their hearts they practice wickedness and they're a walking contradiction. They're hypocrites. If you're going in that direction, you've got to have a righteousness that's a whole lot better. He's doing a couple of things here. Later we would call the Pharisees whitewashed tombs. On the outside, looking good. And the inside, there's a stink in there. The legalistic outward code might be impressing the common people, but it wasn't impressing God. It was a fail. And I think the other aspect of Jesus' curveball comment is, because keeping the law perfectly is impossible, that's how extreme it is, then he's come to do it for us. He's come to fulfill the law because we can't. We cannot do it. Isn't that incredible? Isn't that a revolutionary shift in teaching at the time? But our whole culture is wired to ideas like do better, be better, earn the right, succeed, get promoted for being the best. We worship our celebrities and our stars and our sports stars. Be the best. Jesus is saying you can't. When it comes to being holy, you haven't got a shot at this. And God's righteousness is all of mercy. It's grace, giving us what we don't deserve. Can you see those ideas of righteousness all starting to come together in this obscure things that Jesus is saying? And if you remember our opening idea, the teacher who said you've got to get a better grade than the smarty kids or you won't pass, imagine if that teacher the next week at the lunchtime meeting said, you know what, I'm going to sit the exam for you. That's what Jesus is doing when he fulfills the law. We're already a fail. In this obscure teaching, I believe Jesus is laying the first foundations of the idea of atonement and grace. And it's a radical teaching. The way these couple of words, fulfill and righteousness, fit together is a veiled hint of what would take place on the cross. Did Jesus expect anyone on that mountain to get it in that moment? I don't think so. I think that's like trying to expect people to get Wordle in one go. Oh, you're not doing Wordle? Did Jesus expect anyone to get it? I don't think so, but it is certainly there for us to ponder and to be amazed by. The amazing grace that would be revealed by the end of Matthew's gospel at the cross. That rather than needing to surpass the righteousness of the Pharisees, we, by faith in Jesus, could enjoy the new status, justified, right in justice before God. It's all about Jesus pays the penalty for our sins, fulfills. It's all about Jesus' righteousness, his holiness, being reckoned to our spiritual bank account. And it's us responding righteously by seeking the new way to live in grace and obeying him. What does a past look like with God? Because our world wants to know. Looks like faith in Jesus' death and resurrection for the forgiveness of sins, and responding with a life of thankfulness and faithfulness.